Good morning, everybody. Stuart Torrance here, Men's Health Project Officer for the Australian Men's Shed Association. Let me introduce to you this morning our guest, whilst he is actually logging on and getting ready. We're going to be having a chat with Barry Goanna Golding, Professor Barry Golding, that is. He's a Bachelor of Science Honours in Geology, Master in Environmental Science at Monash University, Bachelor of Arts, Philosophy and Science and Feminism from Deakin University, Diploma of Education and Graduate Diploma of Educational Administration, University of Melbourne, and the list of academic qualifications go on and on and on. Barry has extensive education and research in adult community education. He founded the RAVE organisation, Research Adult and Vocational Education Group. He's deeply ingrained in Indigenous vocational education, adult and community education, and men's lifelong and life-wide, I like that terminology, learning, health and well-being in a community setting. So since 2015, Dr. Barry Golding has been the Honorary Professor Adjunct of Federation University in Australia, and in 2016 appointed a member of the Order of Australia on the Queen's Birthday Honours List. And here's Barry. Barry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. I'm sorry I'm late. I've just been having some technical issues getting on, Stuart.
That's all right, Barry. Not a problem. I was just going through your little introduction. If you want to keep on, have you got everything organised?
Yeah, it's all good. Is it Zoom or is it an image as well?
Is it? Yeah, you should have a camera on.
Yep. All right.
Yep. Yeah. We can see you. You can't see us.
I'll just put the blind down so it's not quite as bright.
Fantastic, mate. Here we go. So, while Barry's doing that, I'll just continue to introduce him. He was a member of the Order of Australia, Queen's Birthday Honours List in 2016. He's been a patron since the beginning of the Australian Men's Shed Association. He was awarded the association's Ted Donnelly Award for outstanding contribution to Men's Shed movement. He's the inaugural chair of the International Men's Shed Organisation. Founder and former president of the Great Dividing Trail Association, creating four main walking and mountain bike tracks in the Goldfield, called the Goldfield Tracks, and the Lourdeberg Track, I think it's called. Correct me if I'm wrong, Barry.
How do you know all this stuff, Stuart?
Oh, I've been doing my research. I've been digging deep, and I've got some really good stuff. In fact, we've just got to the point where I read in 2080, you won the Australian Penny Farthing Racing Championships, not once, 3 times.
3 times, yeah.
And you now hold the trophy in perpetuity. You get to keep that. Is that right?
I do, yeah. Look, these are you can't hide. You can run, but you can't hide in the world these days, Stuart.
It's been fascinating actually researching you, Barry, and going through. I think while I was still getting my bum wiped, you were writing your first book. There's several books. You've done a lot of research projects. The Men's Shed Movement, A Company of Men, was the first book on the Men's Shed organisation. Was that right?
Yes, it was.
But before that, you wrote and co-edited a book, Men Learning Through Life.
Yeah.
So you've been, and we're going to get onto your book pretty soon, but I would like to tackle a really interesting subject, something else I found out about you. I love the fact that you love going foraging for food. I'm a big believer in that, and I love it. I'd just like to be able to pick the right mushrooms. Yeah. I don't want the ones that kill me, and I don't want the ones that send me haywire.
Actually, it's my daughter. It's my daughter Tanja, who's a very keen fungi expert, and there's a mycologist, a fungi expert in Dalesford called Alison Pulio, who's written a book about it. So there's a lot of expertise in the area I live in about which fungi to eat and which not to eat.
Like, I would love to learn all that sort of stuff. But in the past, I believe you've also done a bit of rabbit hunting.
Yeah, well, that's really going back, Stuart. I used to keep rabbit traps in. Yeah, I don't do that anymore.
Yeah. But I see so many similarities between things that I'm interested in and things that you're interested in, and broad range of interests. But the one that really got me, Barry, was you were the founding member, or one of the former core members, of the 8-person band
Yep.
called Mulgabels Bicycle Band.
Yes.
I want you to tell me about that. Was it just for the girls? Is that why you joined the band?
How long is a piece of string? Look, people who are over 65 would probably remember the band, but anyone younger, it probably wouldn't be on their radar. But we were one of the best known bush bands in Australia between 1971 and 1976.
Right.
And we toured in every state. And we were actually sent overseas to play as Australia's folklore representatives at the World Cup soccer final in Germany, and we played to a live audience of, I don't know, 600 million people or something, worldwide. It was pretty weird because I'd never been overseas before, and we were selected actually by the Whitlam government.
Wow. Okay.
These days, you wouldn't send a white folk band overseas as an Australian folklore representative. It'd be something somewhat more First Nations, but in those days, that was the way it worked, and it was quite fascinating. But we actually travelled in every state, and there's a map actually on my website if anyone wants to have a look. It's on I think there's a page on my website which is Barry Goanna if everyone's looking for it.
Mm-hmm. Is that your actual name, Goanna?
It is.
Or is that your nickname?
No, it's my name.
It's your actual name. I love your parents for that.
No, I did it.
Oh, you did it. Oh, right. Okay, so you changed your name by default. So my oldest son did exactly the same thing.
I love my father, but I like and his name was John. My middle name used to be John, and in my early 20s, I thought I had to exercise some agency, and it's a long story. I could take half an hour to tell you how I got the name, but in the end, my nickname in the band was Barry Goanna.
And you decided to make it official.
And I decided it sort of fitted nicely in the middle of my name, so I just put an anchor on John and replaced it with Goanna. And it's actually quite simple to do. You don't even have to do it by default. If anyone wants to do it.
Okay.
All you need to do is, basically what your name is what you say you are. And as long as you're consistent and tell everybody the same story, you can't be Goanna in one place. And so you just have to be consistent. So you tell the bank that this is my new name.
Oh, okay.
You tell the Australian government passport it's your new name. You tell whatever. So it doesn't change on your birth certificate. I'm still...
Oh, right. Okay.
But anyway, that's...
I just loved it. It's got a really fantastic ring to it. Because you've also had a great interest in the local Aboriginal culture within your community, from an early age, looking at middens and those sort of things.
Well, I'm writing another book at the moment called Unsettling, which is talking about the first 5 years of contact in this in this space. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So who are our listeners, Stuart? Who's out there?
So basically, we've sent this invite out to the shed world. You're a big part of that shed world, and you have been right from the beginning. And you've obviously expanded and shared a lot of research and delved into the actual learning capabilities of the men's shed and the men's shed movement. Yep. I remember sitting next to you at lunch on the Newcastle conference way back then, and remember coming to the end of lunch and thinking I could have sat here for another couple of hours because we were having such an engaging conversation about adult learning. I struggled with adult learning all through my life, and you actually just gave me some feedback saying, well, you know, education, in inverted commas, is not for everybody. We all learn differently, and that's the beauty of the Men's Shed organization.
Yeah.
We learn from each other in a practical manner.
Yeah.
So education has been a lot to do with who you are and what has made you who you are and what has developed. But I now want to go on to the book. The book is now called, and is coming out, is Shoulder to Shoulder, Broadening the Men's Shed Movement. And that was just launched this month, is that right?
Yes, it was published in the US. I haven't yet seen a hard copy, but I've basically it's being printed and distributed as we speak. And I think there's a flyer that I sent to AMSA that someone's probably going to post. But if you go online, you'll find it. If you just put in Shoulder to Shoulder, Broadening the Men's Shed Movement, you'll find a link which takes you straight to an order form if you want to buy it. So it's available for some hard copy. Hard copy, I think, is $65 US, which is not cheap. The soft cover copy, I think, is $50, but of course you've got freight on top of that. So you know, it's a huge book. It's 426 pages.
That's a heck of a lot of research, because the first book you did focused on basically Australia, the UK, and the emerging European market of sheds, should I say? And this one is now the worldwide, and putting everything into context. Is that right?
It is, and just so you know what happened when I started writing, David Helmers, who's the AMSA executive officer, as we all know, I told him that I was going to do some new case studies, that is, new stories about sheds from around the world. And there's actually, I think, there's 56 new case studies in the book. But David said, why wouldn't you go back to the people? Why don't you go back to the sheds that you actually visited, metaphorically, you know, that you wrote about in 2015, and find out what's happened to them. So I actually contacted all of there was about 80 sheds that were included in the first book. So I actually went back to all of them. And there's what I call revisited case studies in the book of 67 of those. So to give an example, you know, in my 2015 book, I went to the Tintinara Men's Shed. And so I went back to Tintinara contact. I didn't go back physically. I emailed them and said, hey, what's happened in the last 6 years? So in a sense, there's this incredible story about what's happened to sheds, particular sheds, not just general sheds, but sheds, particular sheds in England, particular sheds in Scotland, particular sheds in Ireland. So so there's 131 case studies in the book.
Yeah.
And what interests a lot of people, including the men's shed, is this is actually a separate chapter on women's sheds. We'll probably come to that later.
Yeah. We'll touch on that down the track. But I think what's interesting is the actual expansion of sheds, where they've spread to. Like it's an Australian innovation. And just like everything else brilliant about Australia, we export it across the world. And men's sheds have been noted.
Yeah, well, basically, I've just got the figures in front of me. There's depending on how you count them, but there's around 1,300 in Australia. There's about 540 in England, 120 in Scotland, 75 in Wales, 69 in Northern Ireland, 391 just in the Republic of Ireland. And I'll pause there, because when you actually divide the number of sheds by the population, there's 83 sheds in the Republic of Ireland for every 1 million people. and that's
That's
about twice the density as there is in Australia. So Ireland,
I was going to say, what's the difference with Australia?
well,
We're half that.
just so you know, there's 51 per million people in Australia. There's 83 per million people in Ireland. So there's actually more in Ireland per head of population than there is in Australia. But in addition, of course, there's 121 in New Zealand. There's now 40 in Canada, 19 in the US, and there's 35 in Denmark, which is really fascinating. And because if they called them men's sheds in Danish, they wouldn't know what that meant. And it doesn't easily translate. So they're called men's modestida, which means basically men's meeting place.
Oh, right, okay.
And I could talk about that till the cows come home. But there's a separate chapter in the book just about the Danish sheds, and they're just fascinating.
Well, American sheds have the same issue. A shed to them is a lawn locker, and why would you go to the lawn locker? You need to call it a barn or a workshop.
Interestingly, they've bitten the bullet and they've called them men's sheds, and they're going off anyway.
That they are. They're going ahead in leaps and bounds. But one of the areas that really interests me is when you mention Kenya.
Yeah.
I never knew we had sheds in Kenya. Tell me about them.
Well, there's 11 sheds in Kenya. There's an account in the book. What I did is basically wrote 7 chapters about each of the big national movements. And then I lumped all the other smaller startups and nations in a separate chapter. I think it's it's chapters where I lump all the other sheds together. And that includes Kenya, where there's 11 sheds, and there's also 4 sheds in Iceland, and they've been set up through the Icelandic Red Cross.
Okay, so they're mainly for the indigenous communities, like that are far flung, or in the main cities.
No, they're in a whole lot of places in Iceland, and they've got some sheds which have got 130 men as members, and they've got a waiting list.
Sensational! I love how it's just blossomed right across the world. It's actually reading this book is going to be very interesting because there's a whole heap of information that you've obviously researched and pulled together. I think one of the interesting things was the global financial crisis. You mentioned Ireland, but the global financial crisis saw the sheds in Ireland grow exponentially in a very short time frame. Why do you think it works, and who do you think it works for?
Okay. Well, to date, it's mainly for older men beyond paid work. But what I demonstrate in the book is that there's many other ways of doing it. I mean, it's fairly obvious. If you create a men's shed that's only open during working hours on a weekday, which is what most sheds are, it's not going to have guys who are in paid work.
Yeah.
And so if you tweak the model, as some sheds have done, to operate at different times on different days, or in some cases, call it by a slightly different name. And I know this might grate with some traditionalists, but so there's a number of young people who actually don't necessarily want to be in a shed with other men. They'd like to be there with their girlfriend, there with their female partner, with a whole lot of other hipsters, whether they're male or female, they don't care.
Yeah.
They enjoy doing stuff in the shed, but they're not necessarily about doing it with men.
Yeah.
And in the UK, some of the sheds have set up what they call maker spaces. And this is a young hipster type thing where these people want access to 3D printers. They want access to lathes and thicknesses and all the good gear that a men's shed's got. But they don't necessarily want to do it with a whole lot of old blokes.
Yeah.
And what a number of sheds have shown is if you call it just a shed, and there's an example in the book called the Frome Shed, which is in Frome in England, and 2 days a shed, where as far as the men are concerned, it's just a men's shed.
Yeah.
2 other days a week, it's a women's shed. And on another day, it's a maker space.
Okay.
Where it's just for anybody who wants to have access to the good gear. And if you think about it, a lot of sheds are only open 1, 2, 3, 4 days a week.
Yeah.
And it's empty on, Sunday afternoon. It's empty on Wednesday. It's empty on Friday. It's no
talk
more,
about utilising the space better.
It's no more expensive and probably an efficient use of resources to set up different programs on different days, sometimes under the one roof, and sometimes through the same organisation, but sometimes through different organisations. So there's a lot of different ways of cutting it, and I think that's important, and that's one of the important messages in the book. If we get stuck in just calling it a place for old blokes, it'll be for old blokes. But if you want to tweak it, I'm not saying you have to tweak it, but I'm saying
it can be anything.
It can be whatever you want it to be, and I think that's the beautiful thing about it. And
I think in go into any shed and you'll see the variance right across the board. It's those who were the foundation members that seem to set the standard and the flow of the shed, and you get a total variance across the board, won't you?
And I'm not here to tell shedders how it might be configured.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Barry, sorry, Barry. I just want to get back. We looked at the GFC being the perfect storm for the expansion of the Irish men's shed. Do you think the same thing is going to happen with COVID? Now a lot of people have changed jobs and the like.
Absolutely, and I think that's one of the messages in the book. I mean, it was incredibly opportune that I wrote this during the pandemic.
Yeah,
I had a lot of time.
Didn't we all?
B, I found was that while we did it hard in Australia in terms of lockdown, and some people were impacted and some people have had COVID and some people have died, it's nothing like what they've experienced, for example, in Ireland and England. A number of sheds have lost a number of their shedders. Yeah. Or they've been, locked out of the shed and they've been dealing with all sorts of issues. And even when the shed's reopened, some guys are understandably freaked out about going back into the space because they're concerned about infection. Yeah.
So let's just talk about sorry, Barry. Sorry.
No, I'm really easy at leading you off the track. You're the
we're doing well. I'm interested in the diversity of sheds. Obviously, we've touched on females in sheds, the different demographics of shed members, the diversity and of the context in which men's sheds are operating in. So you've got sheds in far-flung areas, but you've also got lots of sheds in the centre of towns and the like. Tell me a bit about the differences and the diversity within sheds. Okay.
I think if you're setting up a shed in a small town, as a lot of them in Australia are, you take all comers. And so you'll have some Vietnam veterans. Yeah. You'll have some you'll have some recent war veterans. You might have some men with dementia. You may have some expert craft workers who want access to the good gear. You may have
Aboriginal groups and
Aboriginal men, First Nations men. You may have some local refugees who are working at the meatworks, who benefit from the company of other men who are born in Australia. Yeah, it can be so diverse, and I just think, rather than just assuming it's just for old men, we really do have to broaden it. Yeah, and that's my message in the book. If we want, in the end, men's sheds should represent the nature of Australia.
Mm.
And Australia is a multicultural society. It's also a First Nations society.
Mm-hmm.
And, every community's got a very diverse community. And I guess we should be trying to reach all of the people I've just mentioned.
Yeah.
And I think, and it's really important for me that we also reach what some people call gender diverse people. So men's shed should be welcoming for gay, transsexual and transgender men. It's that simple. In the end, if you play league football or rugby league in Australia, you can't be homophobic. You can't you can't discriminate against people who have different sexual preferences. You can't discriminate legally on the basis of people's First Nation status. You can't discriminate on the basis of ethnicity. And it has to be the same in men's sheds. All men have to be welcome.
Yeah.
Gender diverse men, and also men from diverse cultural and linguistic backgrounds. And that's a really strong message in my book.
The other thing that I picked up on was the men in incarceration.
Yes.
I found that a very interesting topic, and something I see sheds as being able to be transitional once they leave incarceration, but actually to have a shed in there, I think is a great initiative. Where was that?
That's in Waterford in Ireland. But there's also a really good example here in Victoria. The Beechworth Men's Shed is the Beechworth has a low security prison in Beechworth, and the Beechworth Men's Shed does some amazing stuff with the inmates. And on one day a week, the inmates come into the shed.
Oh, fantastic! So a bit like day release.
It's like day release, and they
fantastic.
And the shed helps them with their tools, and the shed will send out somebody to work with the guys, and the guys will come into the shed.
Yeah.
And a number of the guys who've been released have come back and joined the shed engaged and thanked them. So there's all sorts of those. I mean, you can't have high security men walking into a men's shed every day.
Yeah. But they've taken an initiative. They've taken an initiative to reach out and help people that are probably in a very vulnerable space, don't have much of a future. But when the men's shed sort of opens up that door, everything becomes possible.
Well, yeah, I think Beechworth's done an amazing. Beechworth's actually one of the case studies in my book,
and that's fantastic.
That story about how they work it with the low security prisoners is actually so is the one about the prison in Wicklow.
Yeah,
there's also a shed in a refugee centre in Ireland where they've got basically people who are sort of semi-locked up, and in order to expose them into the wider community, they've set up a shed in the refugee centre.
We could learn something there, Barry. Just saying.
Well,
we hear of riots and uprisings and dissension because they're in there for such a long time.
Yeah.
Is it as simple as setting up a men's shed to address that?
Well, this one has worked really well, and it's actually been done with the. I'm just being told by one of the panelists. It's actually called direct provision in Ireland. It isn't called a refugee centre, but
right.
So that's what it's called in the book. But I called it a refugee centre so the people who are listening understand. But it is true. It's called direct provision.
Fantastic.
It's the state provides these places for refugees, which are basically, if I can be frank, they're sort of rundown hotels and motels.
Okay.
Yeah.
Barry, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. Over 1,300 sheds in Australia. I think we mentioned 2,700 sheds across the world. mate, even a shed, 11 sheds in Kenya. So that's the one that blows me, and I'm going to read about that when I get your book, and I'm going to look them up, because I think that's an interesting engagement across the world. Barry, thank you very much for the opportunity to have a chat. Just a few questions. Is the book going to be available on Amazon?
I'm not the publisher, but I'm told by the publisher, which is called Common Ground, it will be available through Amazon.
Right, fantastic.
Yeah. If you put in the name of the book, Shoulder to Shoulder, you'll get a lot of other books, because there's other books been called Shoulder to Shoulder over the years, and you'll get John Howard and all sorts of other things when you put in Shoulder to Shoulder. But if you put in Broadening the Men's Shed Movement, you'll find the link will come up, and the book is available now.
Barry, I believe for some of the questions that we've been given, we're going to give away a book. Quick question. Will the book be available in digital format?
It is.
Will it be an audio book?
Only if you read it, Stuart.
I knew I'd get myself a job. Fair income. Great to see you again, Barry. So that was from Dan.
Yeah. Just before you sign off, I think it's important to note that one of the things that comes through really strongly in the book, if I could just spend 2 minutes saying it,
please,
is the fact that many men's sheds are actually already open and involve women. And so for those people who say, oh, a men's shed has to be, what I actually found is that many, many men's sheds around the world are already finding ways of including women without necessarily not having a space for men on a particular day.
Yeah. I'm with you, Barry. I think the women are really the backbone and total supporters of the sheds.
And the separate chapter on women's sheds actually tells that story in a really interesting way. There's a whole lot of them all around the world. Half of them are in Australia, and some of them are working in collaboration with men's sheds. And the best case study in the whole book, read it, is at Yeovil, Yeoval, which is up in Western New South Wales. And the women's shed secretary is the wife of the men's shed president. So as I joked the other day, the women's shed secretary is sleeping with the men's shed president, and you can't get better collaboration than that.
That's too true. But isn't that quite often the way the women pick up the slack in these very important jobs and roles within the sheds to support their men to ensure that they get that engagement?
And that doesn't necessarily mean you have to not have one day or a day or two for men where it's just men, but all sorts of other things are possible. And that's the message in the book. Some sheds are struggling because there's just got a lot of old men who are getting sick and dying.
Yeah.
And if you've got that problem, there are solutions, and you don't need to look far to find them. So my message is about reinventing your shed and reinventing the ways of doing stuff, because there's young people, there's kids, there's people with dementia, there's all sorts of ways of tweaking the model, which can be really, really effective in reaching more diverse men.
Yeah. Also
some women sometimes, and also doing more interesting stuff for the community.
Barry, it's been absolutely fascinating. The book is going to be a great read. I'm looking forward to getting my hands on a copy. We'll pick a questionnaire to send out a copy of your book. Can we get it signed, Barry?
Yeah, well, I have to get my copy first.
Well, as soon as you get yours, we'll get you to sign one. We'll get you to send it up, and then we'll send it out to one of the attendees that came in on the forum today. But Barry, thank you. Sorry?
Thank everybody for tuning in, and also thanks to the sheds. Without the sheds, I couldn't have written this book. 1/3 of the book is actually written by shedders about their sheds. So I'm just the person on the end of the email, And in a sense, the stories are actually from the sheds themselves. So without the sheds, I couldn't have done this.
I think we're going to really enjoy reading about ourselves going forward. Thank you very much, Barry. And this is the introduction of Shoulder to Shoulder, Broadening the Men's Shed Movement, written by Dr. Barry Golding. Barry Goanna Golding, I love that. And I'd like to really thank you for your time this morning, Barry, and appreciate you coming on board. Next week, Marty Least will be interviewing Mark Valencio from Self-Sufficient Me. He has his own website, and he'll be talking all things gardening. So tune in next week. Don't forget to get onto the Shed Online. Listen to the Shed Wireless. There's also a host of interesting topics and discussions being held in those forums too. Thank you all for tuning in, and we shall see you next week. Same time, same place.